Hi, in this video I'll be discussing the central nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the brain has two hemispheres which are separated by the longitudinal fissure, and each hemisphere is divided into four lobes, namely the frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes that all make up the cerebral cortex. Anatomically, we have different sides to our brain. The front view is called the anterior, the rear view posterior, the top is dorsal, and the bottom is ventral. There's also the lateral fissure, which separates the frontal and temporal lobes, and the small little grooves on the surface of the brain are called sulci. There are also larger sulci, such as the central sulcus, which separates the frontal and parietal lobes. The frontal lobes deal with functions such as planning, reasoning, problem-solving, emotions, movement, and control our behavior. The frontal lobes gather information from other lobes, and its most basic job is to produce movement, where it turns information gathered from the environment into response. The frontal lobes of humans are highly developed, as we have a wide range of responses to external information at our disposal. Compare that to animals such as mice. Their frontal lobes are much smaller, so they have simpler responses such as fight or flight. It's not to say that other areas of the brain aren't important, but the frontal lobes allow us to carry out highly sophisticated levels of thinking that allow us to debate, love, and form relationships, create, and be rational. And therefore, damage to the frontal lobes can cause serious problems in our behavior, which will be our main focus in the next video. The temporal lobes deal with processing visual and auditory and sensory stimuli, as well as coordinate movement and speech, and is also responsible for long-term memory. Expanding on these functions, starting with processing auditory stimuli, the temporal lobe has what is called the primary auditory cortex, which is responsible for taking in and interpreting information from the auditory receptors. As we'll find out, although the temporal lobe isn't the only brain region that deals with auditory processing, it is the most important. Now, the lowest parts of the temporal lobe deal with the intake and interpretation of visual information, including visual memory such as facial recognition. Some parts of the temporal lobe, including the hippocampus, also play a role in memory, but this time it's for special memory like remembering where a place is located or where you are, and navigating to and from places. The left side of the temporal lobe deals with speech and contains Wernicke's area and is responsible for verbal memory and the comprehension of speech. Lastly, as you can probably tell by now, the temporal lobe deals with memory with the hippocampus as its main actor, and it deals with maintaining new memories and storing old ones into long-term memory. The parietal lobe is important for sensory perception and the integration of sensory information such as sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. The parietal lobe is also located in what is called the primary sensory area, where sensory information from other areas of the body are interpreted. Some parts of the body will generate more information than others, and the more sensory information is gathered from that area, the more of the parietal lobe will be dedicated to those areas such as hands and fingers. The occipital lobes are home to the primary visual cortex, and its main function is the control and processing of visual information, which allows us to differentiate between colors and shapes, and where objects are in relation to others. This is also thanks to sensory receptors within the eye that transmit visual information to the brain, and there are two types of receptor cells, rods and cones. The function of rods is to respond to low levels of light, to help us see at night and don't really process color or large amounts of detail. On the other hand, cones respond to higher levels of light and process color and detail. So, how does this work? First, light waves from the environment pass through the cornea and through the pupil where the lenses focus the light onto the retina. This is where rods and cones convert the light waves into signals, which are then processed by ganglion cells and sent to the brain by the optic nerve through the thalamus and then processed in the visual cortex. Notice that each visual field is processed by the opposite side of the visual cortex. Now, looking at the brainstem, it can be divided into three areas: the midbrain, pons, and the medulla. The midbrain is basically an extension of the brainstem, connecting the spinal cord to the forebrain. The midbrain deals with important functions in motor movement, with its main structure being the reticular activating system, or reticular formation. From the spinal cord, sensory information is carried up to the forebrain, and motor information travels down the way to the spinal cord. The pons is the middle part of the brainstem and aids in transmitting information between the cortex and cerebellum. The medulla is the lower portion of the brainstem and has important reflex sensors that control breathing, salivation, vomiting, swallowing, and facial movements. The thalamus can be viewed as a sort of gateway or relay station. It collects sensory information and then spreads it out to the cortex. It also receives information from the cortex, such as motor information, which is then passed down to the cerebellum. The hypothalamus is situated under the thalamus. It's probably one of the most important areas of the brain for homeostasis, or maintaining the body's internal balance and motivation. These include hunger, thirst, sexual behavior, emotional arousal, and stress, among many others. There are 7 areas that can be viewed in the hypothalamus, and each is responsible for a specific function. The posterior deals with sex drive, the anterior and supraoptic deals with water balance, the presupraoptic deals with heat control, the ventromedial deals with hunger, the dorsal with pleasure, and the dorsomedial with aggression. The pituitary gland sits below the hypothalamus, and it's an endocrine gland, which means it produces hormones by taking in messages sent by the hypothalamus that affects many areas of the body. These include other glands that also produce their own hormones and basically regulates the number of hormones needed, which is why the pituitary gland is sometimes called the master gland. The corpus callosum is a C-shaped nerve fiber under the cerebral cortex, which connects the left and right hemispheres. This is important because what it actually does is it takes information from one hemisphere to the other, allowing communication between the two hemispheres. The hippocampus deals with the formation of new memories by creating interconnections in the cerebral cortex. There was an interesting study done in 2003 by McGuire and colleagues. They compared the region of the hippocampus between taxi drivers and regular London drivers, and it was found that taxi drivers actually had a larger hippocampus than regular drivers. This may be because taxi drivers have to memorize many of the routes to many areas, essentially creating an accurate mind map of the city. The amygdala is an almond-shaped structure that is located in front of the hippocampus and is responsible for processing emotions such as responding to fear. This is related to the fight or flight response, in that if we feel that we are in danger, it is likely that our amygdala are highly active, and therefore it is important for our survival. The cerebellum, also known as the little brain or cerebellar cortex, is an area that controls movement, balance, coordination, and muscle tone. This is important as well, as it also acts to respond to sensory signals from the body and other areas of the brain. For example, when we lose balance, signals are sent so that we react and try to balance ourselves back. So, that's it for this video. We have looked at the central nervous system, which consists of the spinal cord and the brain, with all the different parts from the frontal lobes all the way to the medulla. I have skipped some and perhaps more specific parts, but I think that would make this video a bit too long for my liking, and I could probably spend an entire video for each part of the brain in a lot more detail. But maybe some other time. In the next video, we will talk more about the frontal lobes in terms of its functions and anatomy in a little more detail. What happens when they are damaged, what can cause frontal lobe damage, and how to test for frontal lobe functioning. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you then.